kembali lagi di konferensi bawah pohon JCDC bersama dengan saya Miss Jessica, psikolog klinis anak dan remaja di JCDC. Nah, di KBP kali ini kita akan membahas sebuah topik yang spesial, yaitu putting the sensory lens on trauma, di mana kita akan melihat sudut pandang masalah trauma dari aspek sensori atau profil panca indera seorang anak, dan bagaimana sih si trauma itu bisa muncul di anak-anak, dan apa sebenarnya kaitannya dengan profil sensori tersebut. Di KBP kali ini kita sudah mengundang seorang narasumber yang spesial, yaitu Lalu, salah satu seorang okupasi terapis dari Amerika Serikat yang juga belajar dan mendalami mengenai dear floor time, dan beliau pada hari ini akan bersama dengan saya untuk berbincang-bincang seputar masalah trauma dari sudut pandang sensori. Nah, langsung saja kita saksikan perbincangan dengan Maud berikut ini.
So on this occasion, I'm here with Maud already, and we will talk about putting the sensory lens on trauma. Maud is the founder of Total Approach Therapy Clinic and an occupational therapist. Maud is also a training leader for ICDL and the DIR for Meta, serve on the board of directors for Attach for Trauma-Informed Care, and is also an international trainer in Tomatis Sound Therapy. Okay, so Maud, how are you today?
I'm doing well. It's warm and sunny. It's a beautiful day in the US.
Wow. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Maud, do you want to tell us more about you, maybe?
That's always a difficult question. I'm born in South Africa. And and my husband and I married before we got here. So 9 years later, I had to redo my whole final exam to make sure I'm licensed in the US. That was hard. But then, it was beautiful here. And in 2001, I started my practice. In 2004, my husband decided to join me. And in 2007, I started to become an international trainer. And so I am just training everywhere on the globe right now. I will be in Asia in November, December.
Wow.
I'll be in Singapore. Yeah. So so it's the world is opening up now since since COVID is sort of on the downside. I think some countries are still struggling more than other countries, but it looks like people want to see people in face now, but I'm very glad to be with you online. I love training others. I like having parents understand what's happening with their children. I like to have the influence, if I can possibly have an influence, on having people understand children developmentally, so that they don't challenge the children causing behaviors that they could have prevented, So yeah, I think that's enough about me.
Okay, so Mom, today we are going to talk about important topic for nowadays, and it's happening a lot also in Indonesia. It's about trauma, and we all know that we can have a trauma experience from a super early age, right? And it's important to help the children or the parents or the people around them to deal with trauma. But in here, we don't really have much information or deep information about how we can handle trauma. So maybe you can give a brief introduction that nowadays a lot of people use the term trauma, but actually, what is trauma?
An adverse experience in your life that you're having trouble adjusting to. I think that's the shortest answer I can give you. The long answer is in the 4 webinars.
That's right.
But that's the shortest answer. It's and yes, people are maybe sometimes overusing the word trauma. That not everything is a trauma, and we call it little t trauma and big T trauma, right? So that we can make sure. I think the war in Ukraine is a very big T trauma. I think COVID for many people was a very big T trauma. I think for others it was little t. I certainly put myself in that category, that COVID was a little t for me, because there were many things that actually happened. Number one, that I could stay home more. So
Yeah.
so there were some real blessings because before then I was traveling 7 months of the year, you know. So it's I think that trauma can be different for different people. And we have a certain amount of resilience as people. And that resilience gets taxed with trauma. And that's the pieces that we probably need to discuss in even more depth than the 4 webinars, is the whole issue of resilience. But what we will touch on is how's it defined in the literature. We will touch on that. We will talk about, I'll share you some YouTube videos that you can sort of have a little visual, so it's not just me speaking, so that we can sort of look at that and feel it. And then we will really talk about what the impact is on the nervous system, on the social system, the academic system, our stress systems, for sure.
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, so Mark, is there any some kind of minimum age that people can be traumatized, or what is the earliest age people can get trauma?
In utero.
Oh.
In utero.
In utero.
So what they're finding out from the research now is that the babies are picking up what's happening to the moms. So if mom, say, was physically abused while in pregnancy, the baby can pick it up. If the mom has anxiety and stress, now don't get too worried. There's a normal anxiety and stress, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It doesn't mean all anxiety and stress is trauma, right?
Yeah.
But undue, huge amounts of stress and anxiety based on that nervous disposition can cause the fetus in utero to experience trauma. Birth could be trauma. You know, some kids are born with the umbilical cord around the neck and deprived of oxygen. There's all kinds of things that can be trauma, but be careful. Some things are just worked away in some kids' development. Not all of the time will those pieces be trauma. But when it impacts on function, when we start to get an attention deficit, when we start to have a learning disability, when we start to have trouble socially adapting and being relational, when that function is impeded, then we look at, was there possible trauma? Was that events, utero, birth, and onwards? Was that part of a traumatic experience? But of course, the most common trauma out there is when kids are verbally and physically abused, when adults are physically and verbally abused, when there is things like a war going on, when there is these huge pieces that happens globally that impacts all of us. So I think that there's a continuum. And the biggest thing is we cannot afford not to consider it when we have a child referred to us.
Okay. So I get the keyword here is when it's impact functioning, so that we could say it's trauma, but not all conditions, all negative conditions, we can call it trauma, right?
That's right.
And I think there's a lot of causes of childhood trauma, but maybe can you share your experience when you have trauma clients, what are the causes of their trauma?
Well, as we've just said, all of those pieces could be involved, but I think the biggest thing that I, as an occupational therapist, check for is the birth trauma, because a lot of the kids who come to me come for developmental delay reasons. All kinds of diagnoses, but developmental delay is like the big underlying factor. So for me, I would be looking at development. And that's something I will cover, I think, in the 3rd webinar in the series. I'll cover a lot about that developmental pieces so that we can see what is expected at what stage. so that we can discern that. Because especially like developmental trauma, what they talk about now, that is not an official category yet, but everybody talks about it. And developmental trauma is when something happens in a certain stage of development and the child almost gets stuck there. And the child has a hard time going forward, right? And so for me as a developmentalist, I want to look at that piece. I want to look at where is this child possibly stuck? But the important thing is, I cannot deal with a child's sensory systems if I don't also look at the emotional system. Because your sensory piece has an impact on your emotional piece. Your emotional piece has an impact on your sensory piece. So the big piece that we will talk about is how does these things overlap.
Okay, so this is interesting because you are an occupational therapist and you will talk a lot about sensory system, right? From the point of view of sensory system and how it relates to trauma.
That's right.
Can you give maybe concrete example? What is the relationship between trauma and the sensory system?
Like, let's say a child is very touch avoidant. They don't want to touch things. They like don't want to touch a pencil. They don't want to touch something to manipulate. That tactile avoidance. Now, it might not be that bad, but it may just be tags in the shirt or seams in the socks or things like that. Now, that touch avoidance, if I was just looking from my sensory lens, I would kind of say, I must train the touch system. I must expose them. I must give them experiences. I must maybe work through the proprioceptive system to get to the touch system. You know, I must train that. But if I have my trauma lens on me, I may think, oh, this child doesn't want to touch things because he wants to avoid or he wants to remain vigilant about experiences because the trauma experience have left him feeling unsafe, feeling insecure. And so the touch avoidance has become a protection. So in that case, I want to first address why the child needs protection, because otherwise I can't strip him from his protection and start working away on the touch system if I don't work first on why is he needing that kind of protection. So it becomes a very big piece of which do I do first? Very important work.
Really needs good and sharp analysis in just one case,
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so I think this is a question that all the people will looking for the answer. Can you maybe describe briefly how the sensory approach can help children dealing with trauma? Because, you know, we have a mindset that trauma is very psychological, and we all have a mindset that it's only psychotherapy could help. But sensory view is maybe a bit new for us. And can you describe how can we touch the trauma client with the sensory approach?
Well, luckily, I have a lot of people that has already done the research for us. So if you read, just for example, Bessel van der Kolk's book, when he says the body holds the score, and then he wrote the book, the body keeps the score, right?
The score.
So that piece says it all. When I experience an emotional, intense experience, saying the same word twice, but when I have a very emotional experience, the body responds to the stress response in the body, responds to that piece in a very autonomic way. And so the body then develops a cortisol activation is one area. There's many more areas, but the cortisol activation is a big one. They call that the HPA axis, if you want to be fancy. But and then this cortisol experience remains like the vigilance of the body in a trauma person. So they are protecting against having flashbacks. They're protecting against not feeling that again and not being triggered by something that reminds them in their memory bank of those experiences from before. And so that vigilance contains and makes the body inside literally sick. So the organs can be a part of the situation. The interoceptive nervous system, which we'll talk about, can be part of that system. But those systems holds on to the trauma. So when you put a sensory lens on it, you get to be working on it from the body out, so that the body has to relax. The body has to accept new experiences, and new experiences must replace the memory of the old experiences. And so that's part of the sensory lens that you attach to the emotional work. So now it is OT sensory lens and psychologist emotional lens that has to come together. And when you do them together, you have a far better opportunity of working much faster. Let's say the psychologist is working on talk therapy, right? So they're discussing, how was your day and how did things go? Was it a better week than last week? With talk therapy. So I will just give that example, right? If a child is in talk therapy with a psychologist, and the therapist asks them, how was their day? How was their week? And, was there anything very tough this last week? The child can intellectually decide what he wants to say. Yeah. And they can intellectually give you a good, oh, fine, everything's good. That's what the child can say.
Exactly.
But in the body, you can't lie. The body still feels that. So when you work through the body, then out comes what the child needs to say. So it's very important to work with both together and to have both together in a team, making sure that we're giving the physical experiences that's needed so that the talk therapy or the play therapy of the psychologist can have a better place to fall.
So the pain that the trauma gives is like recorded in the body, so that maybe your cognition can lie, but your body cannot lie about the pain of the trauma.
No. Cannot.
Okay.
Cannot.
This is getting more interesting, and I can't wait to see you out on next week. I think all the professionals here are also excited to hear from you. Because we not a lot of people learn deeply about sensory, especially the relationship about sensory and trauma. So I think we will learn a lot from you.
Awesome. Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, Mal, thank you so much for all the information, and for those of you who watch this teaser and getting more curious about what is the sensory view of trauma. Let's take a look at our Instagram at my_JCDC. There's information about professional online seminar with Maud Leroups. And that's all the information you need. You can contact or direct message to JCDC Instagram. And we will see you next week, Maud, online.
Yes, you will.
Yeah. And I think this will be a very insightful 4-session webinar for us. Okay, so yeah. Is there anything you want to add, Maud, before we close this teaser?
No, I just hope that people will find, will join and will find it interesting. I love my contact with Jakarta. I just do. I think JCDC is a very awesome organization that brings this to Jakarta and the Indonesian environment. And, even though we can only learn so much at a webinar and we can only take so much in, I think the more one is exposed to more of the information, the better it is for us to clinically really view what can be the best potential for any child out there. That's so important to me.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Maud. So I think this is the end of our teaser. thank you so much for spending your time with us, and we'll see you again in the next konferensi bawah pohon, and we'll see you especially in the webinar about putting the sensory lens on trauma. Thank you so much, Maud. Good morning and have a nice day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bapak Ibu, bagaimana setelah mendengar penjelasan dari Maud tadi? Saya pribadi merasa sangat insightful sekali mendengar setiap penjelasan yang Maud berikan mengenai trauma dan juga sensori. Di mana saya baru menyadari bahwa ternyata merasa sakit yang ditimbulkan dari trauma itu bisa terekam dalam setiap tubuh kita. Dan itu bisa menimbulkan sensasi-sensasi yang tidak nyaman dari aspek sensori kita. Dan ternyata trauma itu juga bisa muncul bahkan sejak kita berada di dalam kandungan. Oleh sebab itu banyak sekali masalah-masalah perkembangan di anak-anak yang muncul sebenarnya bisa jadi akarnya adalah karena adanya trauma di masa lalu. Dan itu menimbulkan sensasi-sensasi yang tidak nyaman di dalam tubuh seorang anak. Nah, Bapak Ibu, jika Bapak Ibu ingin mengetahui lebih lanjut seputar topik-topik perkembangan anak lainnya yang tentunya tidak kalah menarik, silahkan kunjungi konferensi bawah pohon JCDC lainnya di YouTube channel kami. Kalau begitu, saya Miss Jessica pamit undur diri dan sampai jumpa di KBP berikutnya. Dadah!